ladies and gentlemen. Before the coffee break, we're going to wrap up with 3 country updates. And we have a panel here on stage, actually all the way over there. Already feels like a Brexit a little bit already, Patrick. We'll come to that later, no worries. As you might know, there is a European financing, royalty and holding structuring team. And that team is ongoing, working on structures for the benefit of the network. And it's of course not a coincidence that these 3 countries are here on stage, the UK, Cyprus and Ireland, because you commonly see those kind of countries in these kind of structures. So we invited these 3 gentlemen on stage to give a presentation and an update on the current state of play in their country. I wanted to set the scene briefly before we go into this panel session, but no worries, I won't do that given the presentation of the IBFG we just saw. I think it's clear for everyone that there are extremely hectic times in the Eurozone, and that especially for colleagues like us working on these kind of structures, the challenges are enormous in adapting to these rules. What does it mean exactly for financing and holding structures, and how can we deal with that going forward? So having said that, we have very limited time, although I see on my clock here that I got 82 minutes and 30 seconds. I think it's upside down, the clock. But let's go to the country updates. We'll start with the UK. So I would like to invite my European colleague, Patrick, to the stage to give an update on the UK and tell us about Brexit and much more. Patrick, can I invite you?
Well, thanks, Hudson. Can everyone hear? I never trust technology, so yes, good. Well, firstly, just to deal with the point Hudson made about us being a long way and Brexit being perhaps relevant to that, there are actually no current plans in the UK to pull up the anchor and move the UK further away from Europe, so we will actually still be where we've always been, 22 miles across a little bit of water, as ever, so that at least is staying the same. So, right, just to get my first slide up. Can we do that? Where do I point this thing? Ah, right, okay. So obviously, when talking about the UK, you can't avoid talking about Brexit. In fact, as someone who does quite a bit of presenting, Brexit's brilliant because obviously no one knows what's happening. I can pretty much say whatever I like, and so I am going to say whatever I like. So Brexit first. I think there's been a lot of hysteria, a lot of hype, obviously, about the fact that the negotiations so far haven't got very far, or apparently haven't got very far. We, apparently, on the UK side, are not volunteering enough money. The EU are saying volunteer more money, but they're not saying how much we should volunteer. So what have you actually got there? If you strip away all the hype and forget the fact we're professionals and we think this should be a rational, sensible decision, what have you actually got going on here? And of course, what you've got is a very human negotiation going on between human beings in the normal way that negotiation would happen. If you're buying a car, you don't say, I'm willing to pay you £10,000 for that car. You say, what can I have it for? And if you're selling a car, you don't say, I'll sell it to you for 10, because you hope they might offer you a bit more, don't you? That's what's happening here. It shouldn't be happening, because this is far more important than buying and selling a car. But we are dealing with people, so human relations come into it, and that is, of course, what is going on here. And I don't actually fear the fact that negotiations are apparently not getting very far. I could be completely wrong in that, of course. But I don't fear it because, to me, I'm actually quite surprised there hasn't been a violent falling out between the UK and the EU so far. There's been a lot of talk and a bit of argy-bargy and so on, but nothing particularly horrible has happened yet. I still suspect it will, before ultimately there is something sensible at the end of it. But you can't get away from it. Brexit is an issue. There's uncertainty there, and nothing I can say is going to take that away. But just do remember the context here. It's a negotiation. We can't really expect them to be sitting down and saying, yes, I'll give you 40 billion. Yes, that's wonderful. That'll be fine. Let's get on with it. Because they're going to discuss it for a while, and they're going to argue about it. So deal or no deal? Does it matter one way or the other? Well, obviously it does. We would all prefer that there is some sort of sensible deal at the end of the day, and we know where we are. And in terms of business, certainty is what people want. So to know there is a deal or there isn't a deal, it doesn't really matter which it is for business. They want to know what it's going to be. And we're not going to know for a little while yet. I would like to think that we'll know a little bit more before the end of this year as to whether there is an agreement or a likely agreement over the divorce bill, as it's called. But I don't actually hold my breath too much. It might well still drag on and look like we're going right to the wire. What will happen if we get right to the wire? Will we leave with no deal? Or will there be an extension, a transitional period? I suspect there'll be some sort of transitional period because it just doesn't do anybody any good to have a cliff edge. But it could happen. We can't get away from that. What are clients concerned about? Well, we deal with small and medium-sized entities. We deal with owner-managed businesses, like a lot of us do across the network. So they're slightly different from the very large multinational organisations. They are very concerned about Brexit. Clearly, they are making their plans. They're looking at whether they should be in the UK. They're looking at whether they should have footprints in the EU if they don't already have that. But for a lot of our clients, it's not necessarily that important to them. Now, we're talking to our clients, and we're saying what you need to do is stress test your supply structure. If you're supplying into Europe, what difference does it make if suddenly there are tariffs? What difference does it make if there are tariffs at this level or that level? If we have a World Trade Organization situation or we have some deal better than that? What difference does it make if you're buying loads of stuff from the EU and suddenly you might have difficulties getting those assets into the UK and the tax rates may change? If, having done those stress tests, and we help clients with that, the potential cost is big enough, then you start looking about what you can do about it. And for a lot of our clients, the potential cost isn't that great. And so they're not actually going to do too much about it. But for the larger clients, yes, they're looking at whether they have a distribution structure based in the Netherlands, for instance, whether they want to go to Ireland. And these are the two most common potential locations for a UK business to look to, simply because the Netherlands particularly is known for its distribution structures. I'm not sure it's not the only one, but that's one we know. It's close to us geographically, and we know they deal with it very well. So that's one place. I've got a couple of clients looking to move to the Netherlands for part of their business for that very reason, to have something in the EU. Ireland is the other one we look at, simply because they speak the same language. Well, I sometimes understand what Donald's saying anyway, so you'll hear from him later. You may or may not agree it's the same language. But yes, so they speak the same language, we're very similar cultures, and so Ireland's an obvious place to go, but it doesn't work for everyone because it's further away from Europe, if you think about it. Again, geographically, it is further away. So they're the sort of things we're looking at, and that's the advice we're giving to people. The final point there I've already covered, really. What are clients doing? Well, a lot of them aren't actually doing very much. They're thinking about it. They might be making some plans as to what will happen, but they're not actually doing that much. And what's their biggest concern? Well, it isn't actually tariffs. Most businesses don't care if there's a 5% tariff put on the goods. Yes, it makes a difference, but it's relatively small, especially compared to the currency movements we've seen. But what they are concerned about are certainly people who are exporting. And I've got one very big client myself who rely on the fact they can get their goods to market in Europe quicker than their competitors. So their biggest concern is not a tariff. Their biggest concern is their goods being stuck in customs for a few days, which is what might happen if we have no sort of agreement on how we're going to move stuff around across borders. So that's their concern, and that's why they're looking very seriously at setting something up in the Netherlands. And we did a series of Brexit seminars earlier this year in the UK with our Dutch, German and Irish colleagues, and certainly our Dutch colleagues and Irish colleagues have had comments from a couple of clients thinking about whether they want to do something in those locations. So moving on from what's going on there, is the UK still a good holding company location? Well, obviously the first one there, we have uncertainty over the EU. You can't get away from that. And we're going to have that for some considerable time, I suspect. That might put some people off. It probably has put some people off. But we're still certainly getting a lot of inquiries about using the UK as a holding company jurisdiction. And quite simply, it's because it is still a very attractive location. And the list there is some of the reasons why. I mean, you can read them yourself. We do have this huge treaty network. We do have very competitive corporate tax rates. We do have foreign dividend exemptions, substantial shareholding exemptions, so you can make sales without capital gains tax, and so on. But what we also have, and I haven't put it on the slide, we do have a very stable political and economic situation. Doesn't feel like that sometimes, but actually it is. In a worldwide context, very stable. We have a very stable legal system. And despite what I see sometimes when I'm recruiting new people and berating the level of our education, we do actually have a very well-educated and a very mobile and flexible workforce in the UK. And all those things are very attractive propositions, whether or not we are in the EU. Because it's not just the EU, the UK can be a location for, of course. We're a location for worldwide holding company structures. So, yes, I think the UK is still attractive. Currently, that attraction is a bit less than usual because of the uncertainty. But that is the human element again. Is that uncertainty a significant factor for a lot of people? Maybe not. I think that was all I was going to say at this stage. I'm conscious we haven't got very much time.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And I know you can talk on for more than an hour on Brexit, but we had to limit time to approximately 10 minutes. So I think it was a very well update on the UK. Are there any questions from the audience or the panel now that we have Patrick on stage on Brexit or other items that he discussed? Go ahead, Donald.
Just back to Brexit, I suppose. It's very easy in the media to find negative stories about Brexit and the doom and gloom. What are the positives that you see coming out of Brexit?
Well, that's a very good question. It's tempting to laugh hysterically when asked about positives concerning Brexit, because obviously, again, as professionals, we inevitably focus on what seem to be the negatives. I mean, they're very obvious. We know what we have at the moment. We know what we won't have if Brexit goes ahead. And so there's plenty of negatives you could see. But of course, there are positives as well, or there are potential positives. And having got over the initial shock and having got over the feeling that it's perhaps a daft decision, I think in the UK, and certainly businesses, our clients are certainly looking at what the prospects might be. We know there's going to be some problems coming out of this. We don't know how bad they're going to be yet. We know there's going to be some. But on the other hand, despite what Dex, I think it was Dex, the chap yesterday, was saying, who, by the way, is the most brilliant speaker I've ever heard. I mean, that natural, flowing presentation he did for over an hour is fantastic. I wish I could do that. Very, very good. And I agree with a lot of what he said. But he was saying how we're moving towards a global network for the world, but there's this pressure for people to go their separate ways at the moment. I agree with that, and obviously the UK has had its referendum and has voted to leave, so we're one of those examples. The US have their own issues. Various countries have these sort of things going on at the moment. But one of the other things that comes out of a high technology, very mobile, fast-moving world is the ability of the smaller end individuals and companies to react very quickly to change. And that moves all the way up to the ability of a nation state, perhaps, to react very quickly to change. And clearly, outside the EU, the UK will be free to move much more rapidly in changing what it's doing, making agreements with other people than it would be, and is, as part of the EU. So that could be a positive that comes out of this, the ability to make deals with more countries more quickly and a more open way that we feel is good for us. So, yes, I think there are some positives. Sorry, that was probably far too long.
Oh, that was good. Yeah, here's a question.
What will happen to the withholding tax rates? So, example, you have a UK holding company. UK holding company has subsidiaries in the EU. And right now, I guess because of the European directives, there's no withholding tax from those countries into the UK. What will happen in the future with respect to those?
Well, all we can say at this stage is we have treaties with virtually every country in Europe, probably every country in Europe. And that treaty network will come back into place. So whatever it said in the treaty will be what we have if there is no other agreement.
Just as advantage would be?
Not always, no. I mean, they're not necessarily as good, but they're pretty good, most of them. A lot of them are nil, or perhaps 5%, but it's relatively low levels. And we have treaties with more countries than anybody else, as far as I understand. So yes, there's a change, but it's not necessarily that bad.
I actually got a question that is linked with your question. You mentioned there's a lot of uncertainty around Brexit in the UK and other countries. On the other hand, you see also Theresa May and others actively promoting the attractive UK tax climate. And the UK doesn't have withholding tax on dividends anymore, a full participation exemption. And also the plans to lower the corporate income tax rate to just 17%. And according to remarks of Theresa May, that will be the most attractive tax system of the G20. It remains to be seen whether that's true with all the other developments, but certainly it seems that the UK is taking up this competition, and of course where mainland Europe also is afraid for, is that we will have a tax haven just before the coast of Europe. It's not that far yet, of course, but do you see, besides this uncertainty, also an effect on your tax practice with these developments, which facilitates attracting business to the UK? What's your view on that?
Well, I think the reaction of the UK to reduce the tax rate to 17 was directly related to the Brexit vote. Headline rates are the way a lot of countries are going in terms of attracting investment into their countries. 17% is, as I understand it, the best rate in the G20. It's one of the lowest rates in the world. So it does give the UK an initial headline advantage, I suppose, compared to a lot of other locations in Europe and the US. In your local rate is very low. So I think it does help. I think if we were to increase our tax rates, given the uncertainty over Brexit, that would be a bad thing for the UK, because we need something to overcome at least some of that uncertainty. And the good low tax rate is one of those things we have, and we could potentially reduce it further. There has already been suggestions we might if the negotiations don't go too well. 15% has been mentioned, for instance. But I could easily see us, if pushed enough, going down to similar rates to Ireland. And we already have that in our Northern Ireland part anyway in due course, where there will be that 12.5% rate in due course. So yes, I think it does help. I don't think it's spectacular. I don't think people, businesses aren't daft enough to fall for the fact there's a low rate there as the only story. But it does help. And to answer your point about a tax haven sitting just offshore Europe, well, there's a choice there. Europe are reducing their tax rates to make that more even. But in the UK, we are, I think it's probably right to say, we are at the forefront, or very near the forefront, of the anti-avoidance initiatives that are taking place. We're very early involved in the OECD BEPS project. We've implemented most of the BEPS proposals in our own way already, ahead of the BEPS proposals going through. In the budget we had last week, we put in place, or suggest there's going to be legislation to introduce the multilateral instrument into UK legislation as soon as we can. And we have some new legislation announced last week as well on royalties, where we're going to try and clamp down on sort of Google or Amazon type approaches, where they're selling into the UK from outside and using royalties to tax havens. We're going to start taxing those sales. How on earth we're going to do that, I don't know, but that's a suggestion. We're going to start trying to tax sales to the UK where royalties end up finding their way to tax havens, even though the payer of that royalty is not in the UK. So we have a whole raft of anti-avoidance to avoid the UK being what you're suggesting, an evasion centre, and Paradise Papers or otherwise. I don't think it's probably fair to say we're a tax haven, but certainly we have tax advantages.
Sure. Okay. Yes, go ahead.
As you're aware, our president wants to lower our corporate tax rate to 20%, with the thought process of the deficit we're going to get into the economy from less tax revenue is going to be complemented by increased growth, increased employment, and so forth. Do you think the low tax rate in the UK has helped the economy grow, or remained the same?
I think this particular reduction probably hasn't particularly stimulated the economy. It probably has helped an outflow of investment from the UK caused by Brexit uncertainty. As I say, I think that was needed to try and stop some of the panic that might otherwise have ensued. In terms of the US move, I think a big fear that Europe and the rest of the world has, or should have, and I'm sure there's cleverer people than me that have thought about this more than I have, but given the amount of American money, American business money that is currently liquidating the world, if you like, it's floating around the world, it's not going back to the States because you're going to tax it so badly, it's floating around the world. If that is all sucked back to the UK, to the US, because Mr. Trump gets his 20% rate, and if he has a repatriation tax or whatever, I think it was going to be called, of a very low rate to bring back Apple's hundreds of billions to the US, you have to question what's going to happen to liquidity in the rest of the world. And I think Brexit will be a drop in the ocean compared to that, if it does go ahead. And I kind of hope that on the US side, there is some thought given to the impact on the rest of the world, because that will ultimately, inevitably, have an impact on the US as well.